Thank the member and recognize the member from North Coast.
Thank you. Honourable Speaker, British Columbia has more than twice as many unsolved cases of murdered and missing Aboriginal women than any other province in Canada. And yet, the investigation unit dedicated to looking at the murdered and missing women along Highway 16, otherwise known as the Highway of Tears, has been cut by 84% in the last 2 years by this government. The Highway of Tears is the section of Highway 16 that transects numerous rural, remote, and Aboriginal communities across northern BC between Prince George and Prince Rupert. Transportation options are limited and creative ways of getting around are needed. Some of these creative methods of getting to appointments or getting to school or for purchasing groceries mean resorting to hitchhiking. This is risky, but many feel they have no other choice but to hitchhike. Police report 18 murdered or missing women along this stretch of highway. Others report closer to 40 cases. Nationally, hundreds of women, the majority of which are Aboriginal, have gone missing. I met an Aboriginal woman in Prince Rupert recently who had lost a friend on the Highway of Tears. She spoke about the years she herself had spent hitchhiking along Highway 16 in order to get herself through school. She counted herself lucky as she did not disappear or succumb to violence as many women, including her friend, have along this highway. She explained that in order for her to get an education, she needed to hitchhike to get to school, as there was no public transportation in her community. There were no buses or taxis where she lived, and owning a car was simply not feasible. Honourable Speaker, the Minister of Transportation has suggested a shuttle bus for the Highway of Tears as a simplistic solution to transportation challenges in the north. But until this government is prepared to take leadership and make some major social investments, so-called simple solutions such as a shuttle bus service should be implemented. There are many factors that need addressing to make the Highway of Tears safer. This includes examining economic, health, and social factors, including the history of residential schools and systemic inequality that impact the area. It includes creating and implementing a poverty reduction plan, which this government is simply not interested in doing. Until such time as the prevailing factor of poverty is addressed, a shuttle bus or series of buses serving rural and remote communities along the Highway of Tears is not a bad idea. As the Mayor Smithers recently said, it's inexpensive and it's doable. So I stand here today to argue that knowing this, we should do it. Safe transportation options were proposed in 2006 by the Highway of Tears Symposium, but the government failed to follow up on these recommendations. Recommendation 1 from the symposium report states that a shuttle bus transportation system be established between each town and city located along the entire length of Highway 16, defined as the Highway of Tears. The report explains that, except for the Greyhound bus line that services the Highway 16 corridor from Prince George to Prince Rupert, no other public transportation system exists. A shuttle bus transportation system would focus on the pickup and drop-off of young female passengers at all First Nations communities, towns, and cities located along the entire length of the highway between Prince George and Prince Rupert. In December 2012, Missing Women's Commissioner Wally Opal called on the government to immediately commit to establish safe transportation options along Highway 16. This government said it was developing a targeted consultation plan that would be complete by the summer of 2013. But the government never followed through on this commitment, even though the Minister of Justice's own briefing notes remind her of the need for this urgent measure. February's throne speech made the empty promise to move towards a violence-free BC and ensure women, including Aboriginal and vulnerable women, have the supports they need to help prevent violence, to escape from violent situations. And the government spent the whole session doing little to make women safer. In fact, I personally have asked 11 times about safer transportation options along Highway 16 and have received non-answers and responses that have little to do with the question. The Minister of Justice continues to claim there are transportation options in the north, then lists off wholly inadequate options, such as the Northern Health Bus, which is only for people with health issues with a signed appointment verification form. It's not available to women needing to get groceries, or to get to court, or to an appointment with a social worker, nor is it available to students studying in other communities or needing to travel for employment. The Greyhound bus service, which was dramatically cut along Highway 16 by this government's approval in early 2013, is worse now, down to 14 from 22 trips a week. The Minister of Justice has mentioned the option of the train, which is laughable. The train, which no longer serves the needs of the passengers along Highway 16 corridor, let alone reaches any outlying First Nations communities, is impossible to use. Increased freight through the Port of Prince Rupert has essentially made passenger service secondary and completely unreliable, with major delays, meaning the passenger train spends hours sitting in sidings as container ship traffic takes priority and passes by. Freight trumps people in the rail industry, and hence the train is losing its appeal to tourists and locals alike. Like Greyhound, no doubt we will also hear announcements of passenger rail service reductions in the future. In her budget speech, the Justice Minister said the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry recommendations were, quote, the highest priority in justice. However, contrary to her saying this, the BC Liberal government has failed to implement the majority of the recommendations from the inquiry. The investigation unit dedicated to looking at the murdered and missing women along Highway 16 has been cut by 84% since 2012. The Justice Minister excused these massive cuts by saying there is less investigative work to be done. Yet, not a single one of the outstanding Highway of Tears cases has been solved. BC has the highest number of unsolved cases of missing and murdered Aboriginal women in the country. It's shameful to be cutting the resources needed to solve these cases, to bring closure to grieving families who've never learned what happened to their loved ones. In June, the Premier stood up with First Nations leaders and pledged to end violence against Aboriginal women and girls. I ask, what is the Premier doing to end this violence?
Member from Abbotsford South.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. On behalf of my constituents in Abbotsford South, I'd like to take this opportunity to address this morning's private member's statement entitled A Bus for the Highway of Tears. I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member from North Coast for her passion in raising the issue for safety of travellers along Highway 16, and especially women and First Nations people, and bringing it to the attention of this House. It might interest you to know, Honourable Speaker, that when I saw this statement placed on the order paper, I specifically requested to respond. And I did so in part because of my background as a criminologist, and because I know that this issue and the concern for the safety of women along Highway 16 and Aboriginal women, and in fact, people everywhere and women everywhere in the province is of deep concern to all members of this House. Honourable Speaker, the sheer length of Highway 16, the corridor between Prince George and Prince Rupert, represent hundreds and hundreds of kilometres of highway, and many communities separated with great distance. This distance represents a huge challenge to offer safe, reliable, and frequent ground transportation for residents. Honourable Speaker, I want to assure the member for North Coast that the government is committed to the recommendations contained in the Missing Women's Report to identify safe transportation options along the Highway 16 corridor. And I'm therefore certain the member will welcome the news that in June and July of this year, staff at the Transportation Ministry traveled along Highway 16 corridor and held face-to-face discussions with over 80 communities. They met with the leaders of 12 First Nations. They spoke with 13 different municipalities and regional districts. And out of those discussions, it became apparent that different communities have distinctly different needs. So we are now in the process of developing a number of practical solutions to safely connect residents with services and amenities in the major centres along this corridor. Honourable Speaker, the member will also be interested to know that we will be announcing those initiatives in the not-too-distant future. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Members, the member from Esquimalt Roads wishes to reply in place of the member from North Coast. Is consent granted? Aye. Proceed, member.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and thank you for the House allowing me to respond. It's very heartening to hear the response from the member from Abbotsford South, because I'm sure government in any consultations along Highway 16 have heard what members on this side of the House, and most specifically the representative RMLA in that area. Last Easter, a number of us from this side of the House took it upon ourselves to travel the Highway of Tears from Prince Rupert to Prince George and talk with communities along the way. And what we heard was profound and disturbing, Honourable Speaker, and I think speaks to government's need for immediate and effective action on this. Between 18 and 40 missing and murdered women, those are mothers and sisters and daughters who have gone missing, and families have no idea, in many cases, what has happened to those individuals. If that was happening in our local communities, we would be outraged. We would do everything possible within our means to ensure that that kind of situation did not occur into the future. The solutions for this are often very small, very simple. As the Minister of Transportation has said, it seems like a simplistic response to put a shuttle bus service in place, but in fact, simple is very effective in this case. I want to, in my remarks, pay homage to some of the people that we spoke to along the highway. I want to talk particularly about a woman named Brenda Wilson, who spoke about her sister Ramona, who at the age of 16 hitchhiked 15 minutes away to see a friend because there was no bus service for her to go a few minutes down the road to see her friend in the area that she lived along the Highway of Tears. Ramona went missing. Her body was found several years later. Brenda says that in her case, her family has closure, but many, many families do not, because these women have not been found. We've had a symposium on the Highway of Tears that talked about a shuttle bus service. We've had the very effective Wally Opal's inquiry and recommendations that urgently called for a shuttle bus service. These kinds of transportation solutions are commonplace in every urban area and in many towns and cities across British Columbia. Why this is not available along the Highway of Tears is a mystery that needs to be solved. So I'm here to talk about, Honourable Speaker, the need for the government to take action, not just to talk about consultations, not to promise something in the future, but to talk about real and concrete bus service so people can get around their communities and do the things that we commonly all take for granted, to walk out our door and go get a loaf of bread, take your child to the dentist, go see your social worker, go to work. Those are things we all take for granted in most communities, but you don't along the Highway of Tears. Instead, you risk yourself. Mary T.G. From the carrier Sekani in Prince George said very wisely, millions and billions of dollars of revenue are taken from this area every year. The small amount of money that could be put back for solutions for a shuttle bus service are well deserved in this community. Thank you.
Thank you, member.